1,000 Miles Up the Nile, Section 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 4. Sakkarah and Memphis, Part 1. Having arrived at Bedrashen after dark, and there moored for the night, we were roused early next morning by the furious squabbling and chattering of some 50 or 60 men and boys who, with a score or two of little rough-coated, depressed-looking donkeys, were assembled on the high bank above. Seen thus against the sky, their tattered garments fluttering in the wind, their brown arms and legs in frantic movement, they looked like a troop of mad monkeys let loose. Every moment the uproar grew shriller. Every moment more men, more boys, more donkeys appeared upon the scene. It was as if some new Cadmus had been sowing boys and donkeys broadcast, and they had all come up at once for our benefit. Then it appeared that Ptolemy, knowing how 8 donkeys would be wanted for our united forces, had sent up to the village for 25, intending, with perhaps more wisdom than justice, to select the best and dismiss the others. The result was overwhelming. Misled by the magnitude of the order, and concluding that Cook's party had arrived, every man, boy, and donkey in Bedrashen and the neighboring village of Mitrahina had turned out in hot haste and rushed down to the river, so that by the time breakfast was over there were steeds enough in readiness for all the English in Cairo. I pass over the tumult that ensued when our party at last mounted the 8 likeliest beasts and rode away, leaving the indignant multitude to disperse at leisure. And now our way lies over a dusty flat, across the railway line, past the long, straggling village, and through the famous plantations known as the Palms of Memphis. There is a crowd of patient-looking fellaheen at the little whitewashed station, waiting for the train, and the usual rabble of clamorous water, bread, and fruit sellers. Bedrashen, though a collection of mere mud hovels, looks pretty, nestling in the midst of stately date palms. Square pigeon towers, embedded round the top with layers of wide-mouthed pots and stuck with rows of leafless acacia boughs, like ragged banner poles, stand up at intervals among the huts. The pigeons go in and out of the pots, or sit preening their feathers on the branches. The dogs dash out and bark madly at us as we go by. The little brown children pursue us with cries of baksheesh. The potter, laying out rows of soft, gray, freshly molded clay bowls and kullahs to bake in the sun, stops open-mouthed and stares as if he had never seen a European till this moment. His young wife snatches up her baby and pulls her veil more closely over her face, fearing the evil eye. The village being left behind, we ride on through one long palm grove after another, now skirting the borders of a large sheet of tranquil backwater, now catching a glimpse of the far-off pyramids of Giza, now passing between the huge, irregular mounds of crumbled clay which mark the site of Memphis. Next, beyond these, we come out upon a high embanked road some 20 feet above the plain, which here spreads out like a wide lake and spends its last dark brown alluvial wave against the yellow rocks which define the edge of the desert. High on this barren plateau, seen for the first time in one unbroken panoramic line, there stands a solemn company of pyramids, those of Sakkarah straight before us, those of Dashur to the left, those of Abusir to the right, and the great pyramids of Giza always in the remotest distance. It might be thought there would be some monotony in such a scene, and but little beauty. On the contrary, however, there is beauty of a most subtle and exquisite kind, transcendent beauty of color and atmosphere and sentiment, and no monotony either in the landscape or in the forms of the pyramids. One of these which we are now approaching is built in a succession of platforms gradually decreasing towards the top. Another, down yonder at Dashur, curves outward at the angles, half dome, half pyramid, like the roof of the Palais de Justice in Paris. No two are of precisely the same size, or built at precisely the same angle, and each cluster differs somehow in the grouping. Then again the coloring! Coloring not to be matched with any pigments yet invented. the Libyan rocks like rusty gold, the paler hue of the driven sand slopes, the warm maize of the nearer pyramids which, seen from this distance, takes a tender hint of rose, like the red bloom on an apricot. The delicate tone of these objects against the sky, the infinite gradation of that sky, soft and pearly towards the horizon, blue and burning towards the zenith, the opalescent shadows, pale blue and violet and greenish gray, that nestle in the hollows of the rock and the curves of the sand drifts. All this is beautiful in a way impossible to describe, and, alas, impossible to copy. Nor does the lake-like plain with its palm groves and cornflats form too tame a foreground. It is exactly what is wanted to relieve that glowing distance. And now, as we follow the zigzag of the road, the new pyramids grow gradually larger. The sun mounts higher, the heat increases. We meet a train of camels, buffaloes, shabby-grown sheep, men, women, and children of all ages. The camels are laden with bedding, rugs, mats, and crates of poultry, and carry besides 2 women with babies and 1 very old man. The younger men drive the tired beasts. The rest follow behind. The dust rises after them in a cloud. It is evidently the migration of a family of 3, if not 4 generations. One cannot help being struck by the patriarchal simplicity of the incident. Just thus, with flocks and herds and all his clan, went Abraham into the land of Canaan close upon 4,000 years ago, and at least one of these Sakkarah pyramids was even then the oldest building in the world. It is a touching and picturesque procession, much more picturesque than ours, and much more numerous, notwithstanding that our united forces, including donkey boys, porters, and miscellaneous hangers-on, number nearer 30 than 20 persons. For there are the M.B.'s and their nephew, and El and the rider, and El's maid, and Ptolemy, all on donkeys, and then there are the owners of the donkeys, also on donkeys, and then every donkey has a boy, and every boy has a donkey, and every donkey boy's donkey has an inferior boy in attendance. Our style of dress, too, however convenient, is not exactly in harmony with the surrounding scenery, and one cannot but feel, as these draped and dusty pilgrims pass us on the road, that we cut a sorry figure with our hideous palm-leaf hats, green veils, and white umbrellas. But the most amazing and incongruous personage in our whole procession is unquestionably George. Now George is an English north country groom whom the M.B.'s have brought out from the wilds of Lancashire, partly because he is a good shot and may be useful to Master Alfred after birds and crocodiles, and partly from a well-founded belief in his general abilities. And George, who is a fellow of infinite jest and infinite resource, takes to Eastern life as a duckling to the water. He picks up Arabic as if it were his mother tongue. He skins birds like a practised taxidermist. He can even wash and iron on occasion. He is, in short, groom, footman, housemaid, laundry-maid, stroke-oar, gamekeeper, and general factotum all in one. And besides all this, he is gifted with a comic gravity of countenance that no surprises and no disasters can upset for a moment. To see this worthy anachronism cantering along in his groom's coat and gaiters, livery buttons, spotted neckcloth, tall hat, and all the rest of it, his long legs dangling within an inch of the ground on either side of the most diminutive of donkeys, his double-barreled fowling-piece under his arm, and that imperturbable look on his face, one would have sworn that he and Egypt were friends of old, and that he had been brought up on pyramids from his earliest childhood. It is a long and shelterless ride from the palms to the desert, but we come to the end of it at last, mounting just such another sand slope as that which leads up from the Giza road to the foot of the Great Pyramid. The edge of the plateau here rises abruptly from the plain in one long range of low perpendicular cliffs, pierced with dark mouths of rock-cut sepulchres, while the sand slope by which we are climbing pours down through a breach in the rock, as an alpine snowdrift flows through a mountain gap from the ice level above. And now, having dismounted through compassion for our unfortunate little donkeys, the first thing we observe is the curious mixture of débris underfoot. At Giza one treads only sand and pebbles, but here at Sakkarah the whole plateau is thickly strewn with scraps of broken pottery, limestone, marble and alabaster, flakes of green and blue glaze, bleached bones, shreds of yellow linen, and lumps of some odd-looking dark brown substance, like dried-up sponge. Presently someone picks up a little noseless head of one of the common blue-water funeral statuettes, and immediately we all fall to work, grubbing for treasure. A pure waste of precious time, for though the sand is full of debris, it has been sifted so often and so carefully by the Arabs that it no longer contains anything worth looking for. Meanwhile one finds a fragment of iridescent glass, another a morsel of shattered vase, a third an opaque bead of some kind of yellow paste, and then, with a shock which the present writer at all events will not soon forget, we suddenly discover that these scattered bones are human, that those linen shreds are shreds of ceramic cloths, that yonder odd-looking brown lumps are rent fragments of what once was living flesh. And now for the first time we realize that every inch of this ground on which we are standing, and all those hillocks and hollows and pits in the sand, are violated graves. Ce n'est que le premier pas que coûte. We soon become quite hardened to such sights, and learned to rummage among dusty sepulchres with no more compunction than would have benefited a gang of professional body-snatchers. These are experiences upon which one looks back afterwards with wonder and something like remorse, but so infectious is the universal callousness, and so overmastering is the passion for relic hunting, that I do not doubt we should again do the same things under the same circumstances. Most Egyptian travellers, if questioned, would have to make a similar confession. Shocked at first, they denounce with horror the whole system of sepulchre excavation, legal as well as predatory. Acquiring, however, a taste for scarabs and funerary statuettes, they soon begin to buy with eagerness the spoils of the dead. Finally they forget all their former scruples, and ask no better fortune than to discover and confiscate a tomb for themselves. Notwithstanding that I had first seen the pyramids of Giza, the size of the Sakkarah group, especially of the pyramided platforms, took me by surprise. They are all smaller than the pyramids of Khufu and Khafra, and would no doubt look sufficiently insignificant if seen with them in close juxtaposition, but taken by themselves they are quite vast enough for grandeur. As for the pyramid in platforms, which is the largest at Sakkarah, and next largest to the pyramid of Khafra, its position is so fine, its architectural style so exceptional, its age so immense, that one altogether loses sight of these questions of relative magnitude. If Egyptologists are right in ascribing the royal title hieroglyphed on the inner door of this pyramid to Memphis, the fourth king of the first dynasty, then it is the most ancient building in the world. It had been standing from 500 to 700 years when King Khufu began his great pyramid at Giza. It was over 2,000 years old when Abraham was born. It is now about 6,800 years old according to Manetho and Mariette, or about 4,800 according to the computation of Bunsen. One's imagination recoils upon the brink of such a gulf of time. The door of this pyramid was carried off, with other precious spoils, by Lepsius, and is now in the museum at Berlin. The evidence that identifies the inscription is tolerably direct. According to Manetho, an Egyptian historian who wrote in Greek and lived in the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, King Onophus built for himself a pyramid at a place called Kakom. Now a tablet discovered in the Serapeum by Mariette gives the name of Kakem to the necropolis of Sakkarah, and as the pyramid in stages is not only the largest on this platform, but is also the only one in which a royal cartouche has been found, the conclusion seems obvious. When a building has already stood 5,000 or 6,000 years in a climate where mosses and lichens and all those natural signs of age to which we are accustomed in Europe are unknown, it is not to be supposed that a few centuries more or less can tell upon its outward appearance. yet to my thinking the pyramid of Memphis looks older than those of Giza. If this be only fancy, it gives one, at all events, the impression of belonging structurally to a ruder architectural period. The idea of a monument composed of diminishing platforms is in its nature more primitive than that of a smooth, four-sided pyramid. We remarked that the masonry on one side, I think on the side facing eastwards, was in a much more perfect condition than on either of the others. Wilkinson describes the interior as a hollow dome supported here and there by wooden rafters, and states that the sepulchre chamber was lined with blue porcelain tiles. We would have liked to go inside, but this is no longer possible, the entrance being blocked by a recent fall of masonry. Making up now for lost time, we rode on as far as the house built in 1850 for Mariette's accommodation during the excavation of the Serapeum, a labor which extended over a period of more than 4 years. The Serapeum, it need hardly be said, is the famous and long-lost sepulchral temple of the sacred bulls. These bulls, honored by the Egyptians as successive incarnations of Osiris, inhabited the temple of Apis at Memphis while they lived, and being mummied after death, were buried in catacombs prepared for them in the desert. In 1850, Mariette, travelling in the interests of the French government, discovered both the temple and the catacombs, being, according to his own narrative, indebted for the clue to a certain passage in Strabo, which describes the temple of Serapis as being situate in a district where the sand was so drifted by the wind that the approach to it was in danger of being overwhelmed, while the sphinxes on either side of the great avenue were already more or less buried, some having only their heads above the surface. If Strabo had not written this passage, says Mariette, it is probable that the Serapeum would still be lost under the sands of the necropolis of Sakkarah. One day, however, in 1850, being attracted to Sakkarah by my Egyptological studies, I perceived the head of a sphinx showing above the surface. It evidently occupied its original position. Close by lay a libation table on which was engraved a hieroglyphic inscription to Apis Osiris. Then that passage in Strabo came to my memory, and I knew that beneath my feet lay the avenue leading to the long and vainly sought Serapeum. Without saying a word to anyone, I got some workmen together and we began excavating. The beginning was difficult, but soon the lions, the peacocks, the Greek statues of the Dromos, the inscribed tablets of the temple of Nectanebo rose up from the sands. Thus was the Serapeum discovered. End of section 10.